So in this packet, we're thinking about putting all that we've said together, also thinking about some of the components that we even looked at in labs, some of the structural components to the nervous system, such as the meninges, the ventricles, and we'll talk about how all of that fits in together with the general anatomy of our nervous system. So our first objective is to describe the different types of neurons as well as supporting cells, and then also identify their function. And so just to introduce this here, the central nervous system is going to be brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is going to be everything else, okay? So when we think about brain and spinal cord, that is our central nervous system. That's kind of the CEO, right, the manager. And then we've got the peripheral nervous system, which is basically sending and receiving inputs and other types of signals. And that is everything outside of brain and spinal cord. So that's kind of the main division of our nervous system. Now, specifically the central nervous system, there is a large demand to maintain homeostasis, okay? It's vital to the maintenance of homeostasis. And we talked about the integrating centers. So these higher centers up in the central nervous system in our brain and spinal cord, these are where we send signals when something goes wrong in the brain, not the brain, excuse me, when something goes wrong peripherally. So if you touch a hot stove, that signal is going to be sent to your spinal cord, and then a reflexive action is going to be sent out in order to correct that action. If you get up really quickly, we talked about this example of standing up really quickly, and the blood pressure destabilizes as all the blood pools in your distal limbs, right, in your legs. And so your heart and your more central core organs are going to determine or receive signals of decreased blood pressure. And where do we send that signal? To the brain and spinal cord. So the brain and spinal cord are vital to the maintenance of homeostasis. This is where we see those integrating centers that analyze the information that's coming in, determine if something has gone wrong, and send out the appropriate response. Now, there are many neurons, about 100 billion or so neurons, forming even more than that, right? Even more synapses, so 100 trillion or so synapses. And so this is a very extensive, far-reaching, well-communicated system or network of cells that are responsible for maintaining this homeostasis and sending and receiving these signals as well. The nervous system is responsible for pretty much everything we do, we think, feel, perceive. It is arguably our identity, right? All of your thoughts, all of your memories, all of your emotional triggers, like all that stuff is stored and perceived and communicated using the central nervous system. And so it's still one of the least understood out of all of our organ systems, unfortunately. And it's kind of paradoxical that we have to use the brain to understand the brain, but it's still one of those systems that we know the least about in general. But it is arguably our identity. And this is where we think about things like even mental health disorders. Like these are all related to imbalances with hormones, neurotransmitters, and neurons, sending and receiving signals. So all parts of our personality and our identity. Okay, let's look at some of the players, some of the structures that are involved in the nervous system. Again, specifically the central nervous system here, we've got neurons, and neurons are the excitable cells. So we spoke a lot about them in terms of the action potential. These are the cells that are actually excitable. They can fire action potentials, and then they can instruct things like muscles and glands to do other things as well. We've also got a lot of other supporting cells. These are called glial cells. We'll talk about the different types of glial cells, but there are 5 main types. And these are just cells that are helping neurons to do their job. They're kind of keeping the environment in the nervous system healthy and clean, free of any pathogens, any bacteria. They're also protecting the nervous tissue from whatever is happening in the blood. And we'll talk more about that. But the glial cells are not excitable cells. They don't fire action potentials, at least not usually. We'll talk about one example, or one exception, excuse me. But they just help at playing a supportive role to neurons. We've also got some of the physical supporting structures. We think about our meninges, to the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, the pia mater. And then we'll speak about the blood supply to the brain, and then the blood-brain barrier, and then finally, gray matter versus white matter. all right, which is really just a reflection of myelinated parts of the brain versus unmyelinated parts of the brain. So first, starting off with the main, kind of the star of the show here, these are our neurons. And the neurons are the structural and functional units of the nervous system. This is kind of where all the magic happens. They are responsible for sending and receiving chemical and physical stimuli. They conduct electrochemical impulses, right? Those action potentials that we've been speaking a lot about. They release chemical regulators, those neurotransmitters that, again, we've talked a lot about. And they enable us to perceive different types of stimuli. They enable us to learn, to think, to create memory, to have emotion, to control more practical things like muscle secretion, muscle activity or glandular secretion. And so neurons are really the star of the show. They are what make most of our human function possible. Most of them cannot divide, but they can repair. And so we'll talk a little bit about this as we look at some injuries later on, but our neurons do not have the ability to divide the way that our other cells can, which is undergoing mitosis, but they can repair themselves to some extent. And this is why it's so important if you have any type of nervous injury. It takes a lot of rehabilitation to kind of encourage those nerves to repair themselves because they cannot easily regenerate or just divide and, make a new one the way that liver cells can or muscle cells and so on. Now we can classify our neurons based upon two classifications, based upon a structural classification. We can think about the number of processes that are extending from the soma, right, or the cell body. And on this basis, we can think about unipolar neurons, pseudopolar neurons, but the more important, more relevant classification of neurons is based upon their functional ability or their function. And so this is a functional classification. And on that basis, we have sensory neurons that are bringing information from the world around us. So I think about your optic nerve, think about temperature receptors on your tongue, on your fingers. All that sensory information is being communicated to the central nervous system via those sensory neurons. We've also got motor neurons that are sending out motor instruction, right? Move your hand, move your legs, cough, sneeze, whatever it is. Those instructions are relayed out on our motor neurons. And then we've also got kind of a hybrid here, which are interneurons, also called associated neurons sometimes. And these are involved in both sensory and motor communication. And these are usually exclusively found bridging the gap that's happening within the central nervous system. Okay. All right. So again, thinking about the more important classification being that functional classification based upon the direction of impulses. So our sensory neurons conduct impulses to the central nervous system from sensory organs and glands, right, about the world around us. So here's an example of that sensory neuron sending information to the central nervous system. Motor neurons are going to be sending signals in the opposite direction. So they're sending signals, usually instructions of some sort, from the central nervous system out to our muscles and gland. This includes instructions such as speeding up the heart rate, slowing down the heart rate, moving muscles, glands secreting their secretions, and so on. And that is going to be signals being sent in the opposite direction. And then the third type of neuron, kind of this hybrid, these association or interneurons are usually exclusively in the central nervous system. And they help to regulate the communication with different parts of the central nervous system. So for example, when spinal cord sends signal up to the higher centers in the brain, this is being done on an associated or an interneuron. All right, now we'll speak about the glial cells. So we talked all about the neurons themselves, kind of the main star of the show. What we'll speak about now are the supporting actors, if you will. So the glial cells, again, are not excitable cells, so they don't fire action potentials, but they do help to support the neurons. They help to keep the environment clean. They help to protect the neurons from any type of exposure to any pathogens or any type of damaging substances, toxins, and so on. And there are different types of glial cells that are involved in that support role. So we've got epidemic cells, and I'll kind of just point them out loosely here, but we'll talk about them in more detail on the slides coming up. But we've got the ependymal cells. These are lining the ventricles. And they also are forming the choroid plexus. If you remember the choroid plexus, which we spoke about in lab, this is the structure that makes the cerebrospinal fluid. It makes that CSF. And so ependymal cells are the actual cells that are responsible for making that CSF. We've also got these star-shaped cells called astrocytes. These are going to help protect the nervous tissue from whatever is happening in the blood, and they form the blood-brain barrier. We've got the microglia cells here, these kind of spider-shaped cells off to the side here. These play an immune protective role, so they can engulf bacteria, they can engulf any pathogens that do make their way into the nervous tissue. And then we've got two types of myelinating cells, so cells that actually lay down or produce this myelin. In the central nervous system, these are called oligodendrocytes, and in the peripheral nervous system, these are called Schwann cells. So oligodendrocytes myelinate within the brain and spinal cord. Schwann cells myelinate everywhere else, so our peripheral nerves and other associated structures. So I kind of just went over this, so it's a bit repetitive here, but we'll go over the details of each of these types of cells. Astrocytes, we said, have many functions, mainly that blood-brain barrier. Ependymal cells line our ventricles and produce CSF. Microglia have the ability to phagocyte or phagocytose any type of debris, toxins, pathogens coming in. And then oligodendrocytes myelinate in the central nervous system. Schwann cells myelinate in the peripheral nervous system. All right, now astrocytes, we said, are these star-shaped cells, and their shape is actually very important to their function. So one side of these cells are going to be touching or bridging the neurons. The other side of these cells is going to be touching or bridging the actual capillaries that are in the brain. And what these do is they bridge the connection between the nervous tissue and the non-nervous tissue. In other words, what's happening in our brain. And this creates what's called the blood-brain barrier. And so what it does is it basically protects the nervous tissue from any type of exposure of pathogens or toxins that could be in the blood. And this is really important. This is one of the only areas, we'll talk about another one a little bit later on, but one of the only areas in the body where we see this tight regulation between the blood and the surrounding tissue. And that is because there could be toxins in the blood, there could be pathogens in the blood, and in order to protect the delicate, the vital, sensitive nervous tissue from those types of pathogens, we have the astrocytes that are bridging that communication. Astrocytes also are involved in other things, so they help to remove excess neurotransmitter from the cleft, right? Especially things like glutamate. So excess levels of glutamate can be toxic. And we talked about the need for clearing the cleft at the end of that signal. And so astrocytes are thought to play a role in that as well. They also maintain the normal electrolyte composition of the interstitial fluid in the CNS, especially the levels of potassium in that interstitial fluid. So they kind of regulate how much sodium, how much potassium, how much chloride is existing in the interstitial fluid that is bathing the nervous tissue. And then, as I mentioned earlier, they play a protective role from toxic substances, from any type of oxidative stress that is coming in, reactive oxygen species or ROS. They kind of just protect the nervous tissue from the damaging consequences of some of those blood-borne pathogens and toxins. And then another thing that they do is they play a role in glycogen synthesis. Now, the brain is very sensitive to glucose. Glucose is its preferred compound or molecule for energy production. In fact, when we think about other parts of the brain that can use fats to produce ATP, the brain has very little ability to do that. And so the brain really likes glucose instead. And so in times of low glucose levels, these astrocytes are thought to be able to convert glycogen, make new glycogen that is, and then convert that glycogen to glucose in order to supply the brain's need for glucose. So that is our astrocytes, kind of the number one glial cell. The second type of glial cell is the microglia. And microglia also function alongside, right, in conjunction with astrocytes to protect the neurons from toxic exposure or toxic substances. But these do so in a more active, kind of a more offensive role. So astrocytes play more defense, microglia play more offense. They're actually going to engulf those pathogens. They're going to go after any type of bacteria, any type of, virus, any type of other microbiome, funguses. They are going to go after those molecules, those toxins, engulf them, degrade them, and then remove them from the nervous system. Okay, they can also engulf or degrade any type of dead or injured cells that are no longer functioning adequately. And then they protect the central nervous system from any type of oxidative stress, reactive oxygen species that could be, moving around in the nervous tissue. And then looking at a clinical correlation or a clinical connection here to the function of our glial cells, we'll look at three of our neurodegenerative diseases. And these are diseases where, because of some structural disruption to the nervous tissue, we end up seeing cognitive consequences. So the first one is multiple sclerosis. And multiple sclerosis is where we lose myelin, specifically the oligodendrocytes that are responsible for myelinating the central nervous system. Those cells are disrupted, and then there's not adequate amounts of myelin seen in the central nervous system. And we talked about the importance of myelin. Myelin helps to speed up the conduction of action potentials and speed up the transmission of those impulses, those electrochemical impulses, which is basically helping cells communicate effectively. And so the types of clinical symptoms that we see with people or patients with multiple sclerosis is basically diplopia, so double vision, as we lose the myelin of the optic nerve, the oculomotor nerve. We also see sometimes memory loss because of the loss of that myelin. So there's all types of cognitive dysfunction that's seen when we lose myelin in the central nervous system. The other two types of diseases that we see, Alzheimer's, which is a loss of cholinergic neurons that release acetylcholine. And then these neurons are replaced by plaque tissue or scar tissue. And so this is going to influence not only cognitive ability of the brain, but also movement as well. And so with Alzheimer's patient, the first thing that we see is usually memory loss. So they usually lose their long-term memory. So we want to distinguish this from memory loss of elderly disease. So elderly persons will typically lose their short-term memory. So they may not remember what they had for breakfast. They may not remember what they did this morning, or what they wore yesterday, but they should remember when they got married. They should remember, when they had their first child. They should remember who the president is. And those are the types of memories that we see that are affected as a part of the initial symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And then towards the end of the disease, we typically see more damaging consequences. So the inability to speak, the inability to swallow, to communicate, to chew even, any type of anything that requires the brain, really. And then Parkinson's disease is a similar neurocognitive disorder, but this is really involving more of the movement disorder. So loss of those dopaminergic neurons. We didn't speak a lot about dopamine, but dopamine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's going to help us with the smooth pursuit of our movement, and it's going to help us from having like shaking and moving erratically or sporadically. And so when we lose these dopaminergic neurons, we usually see that as the first symptom. So these patients usually have trembling and inappropriate movement because of the inappropriate movement of their neurons, because they're not appropriately being inhibited by dopamine. And then this disorder usually presents with movement as the first set of symptoms, and then eventually we see more of the cognitive consequences towards the end of the disease.